The night my phone rang at 2 in the morning, and I heard a stranger whisper my daughter's name, my whole body went cold, because nobody outside my family should have known her name. And in that moment I felt a fear so deep that I sat straight up in bed clutching my blanket like it could protect both of us. My daughter Emily was 7 years old, and she was sleeping in the next room hugging her pink blanket that still smelled like baby soap and strawberries, and I had been her mom since the second a nurse placed her in my shaking arms at Pine Valley Medical Center on a snowy January morning in a small Indiana town, where everybody knows everybody, and the grocery store cashier always asks about your kids. I was a single mom working 2 jobs and trying to build a calm, simple life in a beige apartment complex with thin walls and noisy neighbors, and a tiny balcony where I kept 2 dying plants and a plastic chair I liked to sit on in the evenings while Emily colored beside me. I worked mornings at a daycare and evenings at a pizza place, and my whole world was built around Emily's school drop-offs, spelling homework, library books, and Friday movie nights with microwave popcorn and too many blankets. So when that phone call came I froze and whispered, "Who is this?" and the woman on the other end started crying and said, "You do not know me, but I am Emily's real mother." I remember my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was hitting my ribs from the inside, and I whispered that she was wrong, and that she had the wrong number, and she kept saying, "I have been looking for her for years, please do not hang up." I hung up anyway and stared at the dark ceiling while my hands shook and tears ran into my hair, and I kept telling myself it was a prank or a mistake or a cruel joke. But deep down something inside me was already cracking. The next morning I barely made it through breakfast and almost forgot to pack Emily's lunch, and she asked me why I looked tired, and I smiled and told her Mommy just needs more coffee. At work I could not focus and I kept replaying the woman's voice in my head, and after my shift I finally checked my voicemail and saw 3 more missed calls from the same number. That night after Emily fell asleep I listened to the voicemail, and the woman said my name is Laura, and my baby was switched at birth, and I believe Emily is my child, and I have documents and hospital records, and I just want to talk. I sat on the kitchen floor crying so hard my stomach hurt, and I whispered no over and over like that could make it disappear. Emily was my miracle baby because the doctor once told me I might never be able to have kids, and I remembered how scared and happy I was when I went into labor, and how the nurse placed a baby in my arms and said, "Congratulations, Mom." Now someone was telling me that baby was not mine. I called the hospital the next day, and after being passed around on hold with soft music playing through my phone, a woman finally told me that there had been a record issue around the year Emily was born, and that I would need to come in. I went after my evening shift still in my pizza place uniform with flour on my shirt and grease in my hair, and I sat in a small office that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee while a serious-looking man explained that there had been a documented case of 2 babies being switched due to mislabeled wristbands. I remember my ears ringing and my hands going numb, and I whispered, "Are you saying my daughter is not my daughter?" He nodded slowly and said, "Biologically she may not be." I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tight my fingers hurt, and when I got inside I dropped my keys and slid down the door crying so hard my chest felt like it was tearing. I walked into Emily's room and watched her sleep, and every memory of her first steps, her first words, her scraped knees, her school plays, and her bedtime prayers came rushing over me like a wave, and I whispered, "You are mine even if the world says otherwise." I finally agreed to meet Laura in a small park near the river on a Sunday afternoon, and she was sitting on a bench holding a faded photo album and crying before I even said hello. She told me her baby was taken away for testing after birth and returned, but something always felt wrong, and when she later got copies of hospital records, she noticed a discrepancy that led her to search for years. She showed me pictures of a little girl who looked nothing like Emily, but something in my heart told me that child was my blood. We both cried and held each other like 2 strangers connected by the same heartbreak. A DNA test later confirmed everything. Emily was Laura's biological daughter, and my biological daughter was a quiet, shy girl named Megan who lived 3 towns away and called another woman Mom. When I met Megan for the first time, she hid behind her mother's leg and stared at me like I was a stranger, and that hurt more than anything I had ever felt. Meanwhile, Emily clung to me and cried when Laura hugged her and asked me if she was going to be taken away, and I promised her that no matter what I would always be her mom. There were days I felt angry at the hospital and at the world, and even at Laura, even though I knew she was not the enemy, and nights I lay awake wondering how life could be so cruel and confusing. Slowly we started meeting regularly, and the girls got to know both families, and it was awkward and emotional, and sometimes painful and sometimes beautiful. Emily would tell me about the pancakes Laura made and Megan would shyly show me her drawings. And over time something unexpected happened, which was healing. Love began to grow in places I never thought it could. I realized that blood might create a connection. But love builds a family, and no mistake could erase the years of motherhood I had poured into Emily. One night Emily hugged me tight and said, "You are my real mom, because you are the one who tucks me in and kisses my forehead." And that was the moment I understood that motherhood is not about a hospital bracelet but about the heart. And even though my life had been shaken and changed forever, I learned that love can stretch wider than pain, and that sometimes the deepest heartbreak opens the door to a bigger, more compassionate family. And the life lesson I carry now is that the people we raise with love will always be our true children, no matter what the world says. The months after that were the hardest and strangest months of my life, and every day felt like walking through fog because nothing was clear and nothing felt steady anymore. And yet the world around us kept moving like normal, with school buses stopping on the corner, and the grocery store putting out Halloween candy, and the leaves turning orange and red like nothing had happened. Emily still went to second grade at Maple Grove Elementary, and I still packed her lunches with smiley face napkins and peanut butter sandwiches, and I still walked her to the bus stop every morning, where old Mrs. Henson waved from her porch and asked how my little girl was doing, and every time I smiled and said she is doing great, while my chest felt tight with secrets I could not share. Laura started coming over on Saturdays, and she would sit on the edge of our couch holding her purse tight on her lap, and watching Emily like she was afraid to blink and miss something. And Emily would look back at me like she was checking if it was okay, and I would nod and force a smile even though my heart was twisting inside. Sometimes Laura would cry quietly and apologize for showing up in our lives like a storm, and I would tell her it was not her fault, and that life made the mistake, not her. And there were moments when we would sit in silence, both holding back tears while Emily colored on the living room floor. Megan started visiting too, and she was shy and spoke softly, and would look around my apartment like she was in someone else's world, and I would offer her juice and cookies, and she would whisper thank you and smile politely, and I could feel a connection trying to form between us that felt fragile and unsure. There were nights I would sit on my balcony after the girls went to bed and stare at the dark sky, listening to distant cars and wondering if I was slowly losing Emily, and if Megan would ever feel like my child, and the fear would wrap around my chest like a heavy blanket. One evening before Thanksgiving, Laura called me and asked if Emily could spend the holiday at her house, and my heart dropped, and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because the idea of waking up without Emily in my apartment on Thanksgiving morning felt unbearable. I told Laura I needed time to think, and that night Emily noticed I was quiet, and asked me if she had done something wrong, and I hugged her and told her no and tried not to cry. After she fell asleep, I stood in her room watching her breathe, and I realized that love sometimes means letting your heart stretch in painful ways, so I called Laura the next day and told her Emily could spend Thanksgiving with her. Thanksgiving morning I woke up to silence instead of Emily's cartoons, and it felt like my apartment had lost its heartbeat, and I sat at the small kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me, and crying into my coffee. Later that afternoon, Laura sent me a photo of Emily smiling in a paper turkey hat, and my heart both warmed and broke at the same time. That evening Megan came over with her family, and we ate turkey and mashed potatoes around my small table, and Megan quietly told me she liked my apartment because it felt cozy and something inside me softened. After dinner she showed me a drawing she made of two houses with hearts floating between them, and she said it was our family's, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I could not stop the tears. Little by little things started to change, and Laura and I learned how to talk without crying, and the girls started to laugh together, and my heart began to accept that our family was becoming something new instead of disappearing. Emily would still crawl into my bed on stormy nights, and whisper that she felt safe with me, and Megan started hugging me goodbye when she left, and every hug felt like a small step toward healing. One night Emily looked at me while I was braiding her hair, and asked if Megan was my real daughter, and I told her yes, and that I loved both of them, and she nodded thoughtfully, and said then our family is bigger now, and that made me smile through tears. Life was no longer simple, but it was becoming honest, and that honesty slowly brought peace into my heart. Winter came early that year, and the first snow covered our apartment parking lot in a quiet white blanket, and Emily pressed her face to the window and begged to build a snowman, And for a moment life almost felt normal again because I was still pulling on her mittens and laughing when she slipped and fell into the snow. Laura stood nearby watching with a soft smile, and Megan stood a few steps behind her holding a carrot for the snowman's nose. And when we were done we all stood there breathing out little clouds, and Emily suddenly grabbed Megan's hand and pulled her closer like it was the most natural thing in the world. And my heart skipped because I realized something was slowly healing right in front of me. Christmas came and it was the hardest holiday I had ever faced because traditions suddenly felt fragile, and I did not know how to share the moments that once belonged only to me and Emily. We decided to celebrate together at my apartment, and my tiny living room was crowded with Laura's family. And Megan's grandparents and the smell of cinnamon candles and ham filled the air, and Emily ran around in her pajamas, showing everyone her new toys. When she finally sat on my lap and said this is the best Christmas ever, I felt both joy and sadness because I knew she did not feel torn like I did, and that somehow made everything more beautiful and more painful at the same time. After everyone left and the apartment grew quiet again, I sat on the couch surrounded by wrapping paper, and felt a deep exhaustion that went beyond my bones and into my soul, and Laura sat beside me, and whispered thank you for sharing her with me, and I finally cried openly in front of her, and told her how afraid I was of losing Emily, and she held my hand and promised that she would never try to take her away from me. Spring slowly crept in and the girls grew closer, and Emily would talk about Megan at school, and Megan would bring Emily little drawings and notes, and I watched them build a sisterhood that neither of them fully understood, but both of them needed. Megan started staying overnight sometimes, and I learned how she liked her toast lightly burned and how she whispered when she was nervous and how she hugged her pillow when she slept, and those tiny details slowly stitched her into my heart. One evening after dinner Megan sat beside me on the couch, and asked if she could call me Mom too, and I froze because I did not want to confuse her, but she looked so hopeful that I gently told her she could call me whatever made her feel safe, and she smiled and softly said okay Mom, and I had to turn my face away, so she would not see the tears running down my cheeks. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that my heart had somehow grown big enough to love 2 children fully, even though it had been broken in ways I never expected. The pain did not disappear, but it changed shape, and became something softer, something I could carry without feeling crushed. I stopped feeling like life had stolen something from me, and started feeling like it had given me something unexpected and sacred. I still had moments when fear would sneak into my chest, especially when Emily hugged Laura tightly, or when Megan ran into her mother's arms, but I learned to breathe through those moments and remind myself that love is not a competition. One quiet Sunday afternoon Emily looked at me and said, Mom, we have 2 families, but that means we have double the love. And I realized that she had already found peace long before I did. And in that moment I understood that healing does not always mean going back to how things were, but learning how to move forward with a bigger heart. Summer rolled in with thick humid air, and the sound of kids riding bikes through the parking lot, and Emily and Megan started spending almost every day together, running through the sprinklers and begging for popsicles, and falling asleep on the couch with cartoons still playing in the background. Neighbors started noticing our strange new family, and old Mrs. Henson asked me one afternoon why there were suddenly 2 little girls calling me Mom, and I just smiled and said my heart got bigger, and she nodded like she somehow understood. There were still hard days though, especially the days when Laura and I had to talk about schedules and school events and doctor appointments and who would take the girls to what, and sometimes our voices would rise and tears would spill. And we would both pull back and apologize because we were both just trying to protect our hearts and our children. One evening after a long argument about Emily spending a week at Laura's house, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the sink full of dishes and feeling completely drained. And suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Emily standing there in her pajamas holding her stuffed rabbit, and she whispered, "Are you mad at me?" And I dropped to my knees and pulled her into my arms and told her that none of this was her fault, and that she could never make me stop loving her. She looked up at me and said, "I know you are my mom and that will never change." And I felt something settle deep in my chest, like a stone finally finding its place. School started again and Emily entered 3rd grade and Megan entered 2nd grade, and I packed 2 lunches some mornings and walked 2 girls to 2 different bus stops, and even though it was busy and tiring it also felt strangely right. One afternoon Megan came home crying because a classmate told her that I was not her real mom, and she felt embarrassed and confused, and I sat on the floor with her and told her that families are built in many different ways, And that love makes a mom real, not blood. Emily overheard us and wrapped her arms around Megan, and said she is our mom, and Megan smiled through her tears. And I knew the girls were teaching me more about love than I could ever teach them. Laura and I started having coffee together on my balcony in the evenings while the girls played. And we talked about work and bills and worries like two tired moms trying to survive, and slowly our pain turned into understanding. She told me she felt guilty for missing Emily's first steps, and I told her I felt guilty for not being there for Megan's, and we cried together, and then laughed because life had given us both something and taken something at the same time. One night Laura looked at me and said, "You saved my daughter," and I shook my head and told her that we both did, and that love found its way where it needed to be. There were still moments of fear and jealousy and sadness, but they were no longer controlling our lives. We were learning how to live inside a story we never chose but were determined to make beautiful anyway. The turning point came on a quiet rainy evening when the power went out in the whole complex, and the hallway filled with voices and the smell of candles, and everyone stepped out onto their balconies like we were all suddenly neighbors again. I lit 3 candles in the living room, and the girls sat on the floor playing a card game while rain tapped against the windows, and Laura sat on the couch rubbing her hands together trying to stay warm. Emily suddenly asked if we could all tell our favorite memory, and without thinking I said mine was the day she learned to ride her bike, because she kept falling and crying but she never gave up, and when she finally rode down the sidewalk without training wheels she threw her hands in the air, and shouted, "I did it, Mom," and I cried all over again just thinking about it. Laura smiled sadly and said she wished she had been there, and Megan quietly said her favorite memory was when I helped her learn her spelling words, and she felt smart for the first time. Something about that moment made me realize that love had already woven us together in ways that could not be undone, and that no paper and no hospital mistake could tear it apart. Later that night, after Laura and Megan went home, Emily crawled into my bed and whispered, "Mom, do you ever feel scared that I might go away?" And my heart broke open. And I told her that sometimes I do, but that love always finds its way back home. And she fell asleep holding my hand. A few weeks later, Laura called me with a shaky voice and told me she had been offered a better job in another town about 2 hours away, and my stomach dropped because I knew what that might mean. She said she did not want to leave and asked what I thought, and for the first time I realized that I was not just afraid of losing Emily, but also afraid of losing Megan and Laura, because they had become part of my life too. We met at our favorite park and talked for hours while the girls played, and in the end Laura turned down the job and said her family mattered more than a paycheck, and I cried because I knew how hard that decision was. I offered to help her look for work closer, and she hugged me like a sister and said thank you for standing with me. Life slowly found a rhythm, and the fear that once ruled my days softened into quiet gratitude. I stopped waking up with panic in my chest, and started waking up with purpose and peace. I began to understand that sometimes life breaks your heart to show you how wide it can stretch, and how many people it can hold. And even though my life would never be the simple, quiet story I once dreamed of, it had become a richer, deeper story filled with unexpected love. And that truth carried me forward one day at a time. As the years slowly moved forward, our strange, beautiful family became something steady instead of fragile, and the fear that once sat heavy in my chest slowly turned into a quiet kind of strength. Emily grew taller and lost her baby curls, and Megan found her voice and started singing loudly around the apartment, and I kept working my 2 jobs while Laura took on extra shifts at her office, and we learned how to share birthdays and school meetings and scrape knees in proud moments. There were still awkward conversations and moments of jealousy and tears, but they were no longer storms, they were just small waves we learned how to ride together. One afternoon Emily came home with a permission slip for a school field trip that needed a parent volunteer, and she looked at me with hopeful eyes and asked if I could come, and before I could answer Megan jumped in, and said, "Can my mom come too?" And suddenly Emily smiled, and said, "Yeah, both my moms can come." That day we walked through the Science Museum together wearing visitor stickers and holding the girls' hands, and for the first time I did not feel like I was sharing something precious, but like I was multiplying it. I caught Laura watching me help Megan tie her shoe, and she whispered thank you, and I realized we were no longer 2 women standing on opposite sides of a mistake, but 2 women standing together inside a bigger family. That evening after the girls fell asleep, Laura and I sat on the balcony listening to crickets. And she admitted she had been afraid that Emily would forget her, and I admitted I had been afraid that Emily would leave me, and we laughed softly, because we had both been carrying the same fear in different ways. We promised to stop letting fear make decisions for us, and to start letting love guide the way instead. From that night on, everything felt lighter, even when life was busy and exhausting and loud. I stopped counting how many nights Emily slept at Laura's house, and started enjoying the nights Megan slept at mine. I stopped feeling like my heart was being split, and started feeling like it was being doubled. I could finally breathe without pain again. And I knew deep down that even though life had changed our story forever, it had also given us a deeper, kinder version of family than I ever thought possible. Years passed quietly but deeply, and one day I realized that our story was no longer something that hurt to think about, but something that felt like a scar that had healed and become part of who we were. Emily entered middle school and started borrowing my sweaters and complaining about homework, and Megan became fearless and loud, and would dance around the living room with her music turned up too high, and my tiny apartment somehow felt fuller and warmer than ever. Laura and I took turns driving to soccer practice and school events and parent-teacher meetings, and sometimes we would sit side by side in folding chairs watching the girls play and quietly share snacks and knowing smiles. One afternoon after a long school day, Emily sat on my bed and told me that a teacher had asked about her family for a project, and she said she told her class that she had two moms, and that both of them loved her, and she smiled proudly, and I felt my chest swell with emotion. Megan overheard and shouted from the hallway that she had two moms too, and I laughed and cried at the same time, because what once felt like a tragedy had become their normal and their pride. There were still moments of sadness, especially when I looked at old baby photos and wondered about the years Megan and I had missed, and the years Laura and Emily had missed. But those thoughts no longer tore me apart, they just reminded me to cherish the moments we still had. One evening after dinner, Megan asked me if I loved her the same as Emily, and I did not hesitate, and told her yes, and she smiled and said, "Then we are really sisters," and ran to hug Emily. I watched them laughing on the couch, and realized that my heart had somehow found room for everyone in this story. And I finally understood that love does not run out when you share it, it grows stronger and wider. Our family was not built by blood or perfection, but by patience, forgiveness, and the courage to keep loving even when it hurts. The summer Emily turned 13 and Megan turned 12, our lives felt steady in a way I once believed would never be possible, and we planned a small backyard birthday party together with cheap string lights and a borrowed grill, and a cake from the grocery store bakery that said "Sisters Forever" in bright blue frosting. They ran around with their friends laughing and spraying each other with water bottles, while Laura and I sat in lawn chairs sharing lemonade, and watching them grow right in front of our eyes. At one point, Emily walked over and sat on my lap like she did when she was little and whispered, "Thank you for being my mom," and I kissed her hair and told her thank you for choosing me every day. Later, Megan hugged me from behind and said, "I am glad I get to have you too," and in that moment I felt something settle in my soul that had been searching for peace for so many years. That night, after everyone left and the lights were turned off and the apartment was quiet, I sat alone in the living room looking at two pairs of shoes by the door, and I thought about the night that phone call shattered my world, and how far we had come since then. I realized that life does not always give us the story we planned, but it gives us the story we need to become stronger, kinder, and more loving people. I did not lose a daughter the night I learned the truth. I gained a bigger family, a deeper heart, and a new understanding of what it truly means to be a mother. And the life lesson that now lives quietly inside me is that real motherhood is not written in hospital records or DNA tests, but in the thousands of ordinary moments when you choose to show up, love deeply, and stay even when life tries to tear everything apart. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in the power of love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another real life story that can change the way you see family and life.